Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm pleased to welcome Maria Hinosa.
Hey everyone, what's up? It's Maria Hinojosa. It's great to be here with you. Thanks to HIP for organizing this conversation. And I'm really honored to be leading this conversation, especially with some pretty extraordinary people. And what we're going to be talking, of course, is about colorism and Latinidad, what it means, and what do we do about it? What's our responsibility? And why it matters so much. So, without further ado, I want to bring on my panel. I have an amazing panel. First is Melak Rashid. She is Director of Development at Smart Development. And Kat Lazo, who is host of Spotify's The Get Up morning show. And finally, la madrina de todo esta conversación, Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, who is president and founder of Creative Justice Initiative. And of course, for me, Marta, we are old buddies. And really, in the 1980s was when I remember seeing you here in New York City, and you were centering the conversation around Afro-Latinidad. And, I was Mexican. I grew up on the south side of Chicago in a Black community. And so for me, when I was finally able to be like, wait a second, it's one, was kind of a revelatory moment for me. Obviously, this is your life, but I want to ask you a little bit about, just to set the scene, because people are like, oh my God, Afro-Latinidad, it's a thing, colorism, it's a thing. Obviously, your whole life you've been talking about it. But I feel like it was in the 1980s, in New York City at least, when this conversation was kind of really bubbling up. And I'm wondering if you could just kind of set the stage for your participation. You're leading this conversation at that time.
I don't know if I'm leading it. There was a lot happening. There was Denise Oliva, Felipe Luciano, Pablo Guzman. It was a moment, right, that the nation was going through the Black Lives Matter of the moment, right? In terms of Blackness, in terms of New Yorkerness, in terms of Mexicanness, Native Americanness, right? So we were all defining ourselves at that moment, right? And we can't look at colorism without looking at racism in the United States and in the globe, without looking at discrimination, and without looking at white supremacy, right? Because oftentimes people talk about colorism and textbooks will tell you it's the discrimination within a group, and looking at who's lighter, who's darker, who's closer to white, who's closer to being of Native or African descent. And therefore, in the scale of caste system within Latin America, right? Who's at the top, who's at the bottom? It means who gets the jobs, who doesn't get the jobs, who gets a tap on the shoulder, who doesn't get a tap on the shoulder. But this really is historic. I mean, a colonization was white supremacy, which has been, como te digo, has been forged within the legal system of the United States, and we're seeing it now. We're seeing it right now with voter suppression. With you can't have control over your body. So what you're seeing is the realization of 500 years of white supremacy being made live in the last administration, and we're living it now.
Right.
It has been systemic from the moment that we were torn out of West Africa, and at the moment that colonizers felt that they owned the land that they don't own, and stole the land of Native peoples.
So Marta right there centralizes it all. I mean, when we, in Mexico, for example, it's clear that there was a conquest, but it isn't framed within the context of white supremacy. And we have to look at it in that context of white supremacy. So, Kat, I'm wondering, you're obviously younger than both myself and Marta. And I'm wondering how you come to the conversation, because I agree with Marta. Like, a lot of this is really painful stuff for certain Latinos and Latinas. If you are Black, it's painful, right? Because you are being discriminated against, harassed, etc. And if you are white or passing, it's problematic because you don't even discuss it, right? It's a total lack of awareness of white supremacy within Latinidad. So, Kat, tell us a little bit about how you arrive at the conversation and from your generation where you see things, because, of course, again, this was in the 1980s that we were talking about this, and I'm wondering how you see it in this generation.
I think, digital media has a lot to do with the progression of information being spread out. So I started off as a YouTuber. That sounds so millennial of me to say, but it is the truth. And I think through social media, I had access, because I think when it comes to academia, we're not taught about, hey, Latinos actually aren't a race. That's not taught, right? Our society has essentially racialized us. And by that, I mean that we're not a race, but yet when you say Latino, someone like me comes to mind, right? Someone a little beige, someone that's mixed, someone that is mestizo. So growing up, I think there were some difficulties in that, many of us feel the sentiment of ni de aquí, ni de allá. I'm not white American, but I'm also not Black American. What is this in between? And I think that for many non-Black Latinos, we still perpetuate, this colorism. I mean, when you look at our media, especially right now, what has happened, the controversy that was in the Heights, a predominantly Dominican, a predominantly Afro-Latino neighborhood. And there were great critiques from folks from my generation, folks like Felice Leon from The Root, an Afro-Latina, who pointed that out. I think social media and just digital media as a whole does a really great job at amplifying the information and the study and the research that folks like Marta have done. So I'm thankful for that passing of knowledge.
I'm wondering, Melach, when you hear this reality, that is, Latinos and Latinas perpetuate this in Latin America, in our home countries. If you watch the telenovelas, it's like Mexico is made up of only people who are super, super white. Like, that's always fascinated me. I'm like, why are there so many? And by the way, I have blonde hair, blue eyed cousins, but there are only 3 of them within the context of this greater reality. But I'm wondering your thoughts on that notion that within the Latina culture, honestly, we have yet to have a deep enough conversation, and what you think about that, Ela.
I've come to realize through my own lived experience as someone I cherish my ethnically mixed background. My dad hails from Venezuela, my grandma's from Venezuela, but I also have Palestinian roots. So seeing colorism on both sides of the spectrum for me, and especially in the Latinx community, I feel the term Latinidad has taken a different term than what it was initially made. It's very difficult to expect one word to encapsulate 30 different countries in the diaspora of the Latinx community, who all 30 countries have different cultures and history. And it's almost as though we celebrate colonialism when we celebrate what the typical white Anglo-Saxon American culture deems as Latinx, right? So we see the telenovelas, we see the commercials, we see, when we see breakthrough artists on things like MTV or BET or these entertainment websites, they fit into the molds of the white passing Latinx member. And it perpetuates this identity where we don't have a place for Black or Afro-Latinos. And even me, as somebody who is white myself, I still, by the looks of someone who's the average white American, I'm a person of color. So I have 1 foot in and 1 foot out the door, but an Afro-Latina does not have that flexibility to have 1 foot in and 1 foot out the door. They are only seen as Black, and they get the treatment no matter what they try and do from the Latino community and then the outside of non-Latino communities. So even on myself, it's an educational curve. I try and always remind people that even myself, with respecting elements of my culture as white passing and as somebody who can have that one foot in and one foot out, I have to be very careful about not romanticizing my ancestors, not romanticizing the parts of our culture that come from the communities that are often left out, specifically Afro-Latinos, who they can't express their culture the same way that I can. So I think it's constant education and self-reminding that I can change and put one foot in and one foot out, and I have to stand up for Black and Afro-Latinos who are often left out when we think about the term Latinidad, to really make sure they're able to be intersectional involved in the community.
So, Marta, Melak is raising this question about Latinidad in and of itself as being problematic. And I'm wondering how you process that larger conversation, because again, having the conversation about colorism and racism within Latino and Latina communities and Latin America means a lot of hard work that our home countries are still processing. Not even, right?
You're breaking up.
So
can you repeat that?
Yeah, I'm just wondering where you think about the fact that that with Latin Americans have yet to deal with this colorism, and how we as descendants of those Latin Americans are having to deal with it here in the United States, and wondering about that double reality.
Well, I don't think that I don't agree with you, and I don't necessarily agree with what was just said. I think that has been sort of the kind of icing conversation that refuses to look at historically what has happened. We have been a people who have been colonized better than 500 years. And we're talking about Native peoples, and we're talking about African people. And we're also talking about poor white people that have been used historically to get privilege, to suppress Native peoples in our land, as well as African people. Because we have a history of Mexico and Brazil bringing in poor white people from Spain and Portugal and other European countries, giving them free land, giving them opportunities to jobs that were not given to Native peoples and African peoples, right? And that is true today. That is true today. So that when we sort of talk in this sort of like sort of icing kind of way of Latinidad, we forget that there are people in jail unnecessarily because of the color of their skin. And I'm talking about both Native and African peoples. And I think that people who can pass or think they pass or think they're in one world and then in another world are refusing to take the responsibility of what is the reality of our people. Right? Is refusing to take on the responsibility that right now land is being taken away from Native peoples because of white supremacy. And if one doesn't stand up and talk on it, wherever you are, in whatever level you are, you have a responsibility. If you have the privilege under white supremacy of skin color, all right, to talk on it. Because it could be like my mother used to say. My mother was very light skinned, sort of the shade of Maria. And she would say, you know, you have to stand up for whoever is treated poorly, because that could be you. That could be your brother. That could be your mother. That could be your sister. When I go to Mexico, my heart cries when I see Native peoples on the sidewalks, right? Peddling, right? Art, no artesanía, art that goes generations back before the founding of what is the United States.
Exacto.
So how is it then, you know, that we don't say, why is this a reality today? Why is it that Native peoples in Mexico is like, ya no existen los incas, ya no existen esas tribus? Si existen, I went into the mountains and people are not speaking Spanish. They're speaking their native land talk, right? If you go into places in Mexico and Brazil, Africans are still speaking not Portuguese or not Spanish, but African languages that they brought with them when they were torn out of West Africa, right? So that for us, and all of us, the native experience is right there.
Exacto.
The African experience is right there, because I can trace my grandmother to being born in 1873 when enslavement ended in Puerto Rico. Right? So it is immediate. So when we talk about it in this sort of very milquetoast way, and I understand millennium, because you're not getting the kind of education that you deserve. But what I say to you, and I say to everyone, it is your responsibility to go deeper. It is your responsibility to know more. It is your responsibility to stand up for who you are and who your neighbor is, because that neighbor is your relative.
You mean as opposed to saying sometimes I'm here, sometimes I'm not. You're basically saying at every point you have to say it doesn't matter where I am in terms of the community.
You have to be clear on your position.
It's where I stand. It's where I stand in solidarity.
Exactly.
Marta, I'm thinking as you're talking, I recently returned. I'm out reporting now again a little bit, and I was in Mississippi of the United States, and there are indigenous people from Central America who are working in the center of Mississippi, along with Mexicanos from Veracruz, which is one of the most African states. And in these areas in Mississippi, people are speaking their indigenous languages.
Yes.
And then I was thinking about what I just saw there, and then what we know exists a stone's throw from where I am right now, which is Harlem. If you go to the Bronx, you will be in one of the largest Garifuna communities outside of Honduras. Exactly. And the Garifuna people. So you are right, Marta. This is very close to us.
It's very immediate. Ride a subway. You have indigenous women and men speaking their language, their native language, right? That they have brought with them. So that we can't talk about it like if it's away, it's not touching us. It touches us, and we are that every day.
And I love, and this is what I'm going to throw to you, Kat, because actually, Marta, I love that you brought up the subway, because it was in the subway. I had two experiences in subways when I first came from Chicago, a very Mexican city, Puerto Rican too. And I come to New York and I get in the subway, and I grew up in a very Black community on the South Side. So I was in the subway, it's all Black people. I'm like, this is cool. And then they were speaking Spanish. And I was like, oh my God, this is kind of extraordinary. I was so happy because in Mexico, again, we do not acknowledge the tercera raíz, the African root. And another subway ride, it was Black folk. And I got close because I'm curious. And I want to throw this out to our audience. Be curious, respectful, but curious. And I remember hearing them speaking, and I was like, they're not speaking Spanish. They're not speaking Cuban Spanish, which sometimes can be hard. And then I just said, please tell me, what are you speaking? And that was when I learned in the subway about the Garifuna people. Kat, you are on a morning show, kind of, big Spotify, people are listening. What are the conversations that you are, as Marta, very pointedly, Marta don't take, ya tú sabes. That's why we love her. That's why we honor her, because Marta no tiene pelos en la lengua. Sometimes it can be hard to hear. But Marta is saying to your generation, basically, like, step up.
100%. Yeah, I love what you said, Martha. I think that's really true. I think folks like myself who have this proximity to whiteness, and I say that understanding that when it comes to oppression and privilege, it's actually not constant, right? Meaning when you walk into a room, you actually should check where you stand. Your identities do fluctuate depending on the folks that are in that room. And so for someone like myself, I think I take the responsibility of being on a national show, a morning show, the Get Up by Spotify, as a huge act of privilege, and one where I think we could easily, my generation could easily perpetuate what we've already seen, which is non-Black Latinos, mestizo Latinas like myself, really taking up a lot of space and not holding and not claiming the privilege that we have right here in the context of the US, right? So I think I take that to heart, and when I walk into spaces, it's my responsibility, it's my duty to continue furthering the conversation, reminding not only Latinos, but also non-Latinos that know we're not a race, and that know we don't all look like like me. We don't all look like the Gina Rodriguez's of Hollywood. There are Latinos of all races, and that is something that we need to remember if we want to further and we want to actually unite. We say Latino gang, but who are we actually claiming to be part of this Latino family?
Malek, I'm wondering your thoughts on, I mean, Marta basically said that she thinks that for someone like you, it's okay to say that you are aware of it, but rather to just say, and therefore, in my role, you know, I always have to be kind of, and I think you were saying, I'm trying to be highly conscious of that. I'm wondering how you further that conversation now within your communities, because also, you know, again, there is racism within the Mexican community. There is racism within the Palestinian community. It's something that I always, like when my abuelita was talking about being worried about Black folks in the Bronx, I was like, where did she learn this? She learned it from Hollywood films. So I'm wondering, Malek, how you see in terms of furthering the conversation and actually understanding and pointing out how much of a role that the media has played in confusing us and keeping Afro-Latinos invisible.
You know, I feel from my experience too, I grew up in New York as well. I was born and raised in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, really close to Sunset. And, you know, living in a really diverse community like that, I got to experience similar experiences like you mentioned on the subway, hearing different people talk, hearing them speak their native tongues in different dialects that to me may not have been familiar. You know, in my role as a professional, I know now that I'm living in Cleveland, it's definitely not as diverse, and there's not as much exposure to the diversity and the intersectionality that exists in the Latino community as there is in New York and Cleveland. So it gets difficult because you do have to give that exposure. And I echo what Kat had mentioned, that we need to make more space, and I do my part to try and make more space and be a part. You know, oftentimes I always tell individuals that us who are white passing, who can, like I mentioned, have that foot in, we need to pave the way and do the legwork so those who don't have that opportunity can get there faster, because without our help doing the legwork, they won't be able and get afforded that opportunity. And a lot of it is because we are given the pedestal. It's made easier for us. So when you see opportunities, like you said, in Hollywood on the media, it trickles down to the average person, assuming that that is the norm and that is what's acceptable, is those who look like Kat or look like myself. But that is the average person, and it's not. So, for example, I do a lot of grant writing work in Cleveland for Latino-led organizations, and I make it a point to do that because we see the work on the ground level, the work done on more national levels. The community needs to get more visibility, and they don't get that without people like myself putting myself on the forefront, because it's easier for me to get it done and be heard than it is for them.
So I think it's very interesting that Malek is in Ohio, because of course Ohio, kind of important politically, and I think that, you know, the state of Ohio is so important, and yet they too have such a lack of awareness of the historical presence of Latinos and Latinas, of Puerto Ricans in Cleveland specifically, who have been there for multi-generations, and because many of us have been migrant workers in that state. But, you know, Cleveland is Ohio is so important in terms of the presidential election. So please vote. Whatever you do in Ohio, please vote. Now, I want to open this up to questions, and if you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A, and we'd be happy to take your questions. Marta, I want you to tell people, you know, what specifically, because I know that there are going to be people who are going to be saying, but what should I do? Apart from getting educated, which is super important, right? Look at the work that Marta Moreno Vega has done in her life's work. I mean, this is urgent because obviously the racial dynamic in this country is the thing that has not been resolved. And until it is and I'm like, you can't make peace. There has to be so much owning of terror and genocide and human trafficking, right? So the urgency to deal with this issue among Latinos and Latinas, what do you want people to do specifically? Because I know there are going to be people who are saying, ¿y yo qué hago? ¿Y yo qué hago?
Well, what you do is speak truth and recognize truth and be willing to change, right? Because we still have, we can go to basic personal experience. I still have students that say, no, because si yo traigo un negro para casa, un negro latino para casa, no, mi mamá le da un ataque, right? And what do you do with that? What you do with it is understand that right now, we represent a majority population in this country. And there's a Los Angeles because we were present, right? Hay un San Antonio because we were present before Europeans were here. And if you're seeing racism work itself out, systemic racism work itself out, it's working itself out right now with the attempt to stop voting, right, of brown and black people. So that tells you that we have a certain power, right, as Latinos in this country right now. And because we're being so divisive because of colorism, because of ethnic identity, because of lack of understanding our wholeness and breaking it up in pieces that are cutting us, right, that are making us bleed, we're not using that power to assure that there's a democracy going forward, that our children, our grandchildren, right, will live in a place where they can have fulfillment. That a few of us have the privilege of being in certain places. Remember, that privilege can be taken away, right? Because many of us have gotten privilege because of the actions of Black Lives Matter, because of the actions of women movement, because of the actions of LGBTQ communities, and so on and so forth. All of a sudden, there's a few people sprinkled in places, right? But as soon as there's no pressure, that tightens up again.
Right.
Right? Maria, you're old enough to go through it. I'm old enough to go through it. I'm older than you, right? And every 10 years, there's a snapping back. You're seeing the snapping back right now. With and I hate to, I'm not a political person, but with the right wing doing what it's doing, it putting our children at risk in Florida, putting our children at risk in different states in the nation, should tell you to wake up, should tell you what you have to do, should tell you that you have a responsibility of being present in your life, because it is life and death right now. Your child can be sent to a school that's not protected and can die. That's how critical it is.
Okay,
so
Marta.
It's not milquetoast. It is a life.
I love this. I want to include some of the questions. One of the questions from the audience was, how do we identify? How do we call ourselves? So I think that's important. I think it also said, I like this question. Could you navigate the idea of Latinx not being a race? How would you define people who are not Black or white? Wow, I'm not going to say the word that they put there. White American culture and privilege are aspirational to many Latinos and Latinas, Latine, therefore life goals. How do you educate them about their own denial? That's a really interesting question. And also, what can and should philanthropy do? Because philanthropy obviously can lead much of the conversation. And so what should philanthropy do? Kat, I'm going to give you an opportunity. There were a lot of questions I threw out there. You can take one or all or some.
I mean, I feel like a lot of these questions are really around what I see pop up is a lot of our own ignorance, right? And what we have to remember is that white supremacy really thrives off of ignorance, and specifically the ignorance around who we are, and also due to the systems of oppression in our society, how our identities are really used against one another. So I say that to say that a question like, how do we identify racially? That's a question that when I was younger literally would cause me panic attacks. You know, once you came to the understanding that, okay, so being Latino, being Latina is not a race. I'm not Black. Sure, down the line, I have indigenous ancestry, but how do I stand, and how do how does my racial identity, how do I present to the world today? And due to those systems, you know, how do I function? That has taken me a long time to get to. And so for me, I've come to terms with, you know, my ancestry is something that I don't deny. I know that in particular on my father's side, he's Peruvian, my mom is Colombian. On my father's side, the native features are there. There's no denying, you know, that my father is a brown man. He walks his life as a brown man, no matter if it's June and no matter if it's December. Whereas my mother is a white Latina. She's a Colombian woman, and that whiteness doesn't deny her Colombianness. And so for me, coming to that realization, for me, I'm like, I'm biracial. You know, if we're talking about race, I'm half white and I'm half native. And with that biracial identity, when I walk into spaces like I touched on before, I think it's important for me to assess, you know, okay, where am I right here? Am I in a position of more privilege? Am I in a position of more perhaps marginalization? And what is my responsibility to do with that?
Yeah, look, I think this notion, and we saw it, we saw that the numbers of Latinos and Latinas who were okay with voting for the former president increased.
Yeah.
Didn't decrease. And so this notion, Malek, about whiteness being aspirational specifically in the United States, specifically going back to, you know, oh my gosh, the Pilgrims, wouldn't it be like they had such great intentions, which is not true. They were conquerors, por favor. And I'm wondering your thoughts on how complicated it is when you do have Latinos and Latinas who can pass or who will do anything they can do in order to pass because they want that proximity to whiteness, because that means success in the United States, because there is white supremacy in this country.
You know, I was thinking about this not too long ago in conversations with family and friends. You know, within the United States, the construct of race is, we're one of the only countries that have this specific construction of race and these categories. And I remember doing on the ground work during the census, and a lot of the Latino community was very confused on how to self-identify, what to do. They were going through the same experience Kat had mentioned, that it was like a self-crisis they were going through. And I feel when we talk about assimilating because it's what we're expected to do, it strips us of our identities to the point where we see, I feel a two divide. You almost feel like with the success that you want to achieve, you have to assimilate to the point where you're losing all sense of your culture and identity. Or the second option is you're deemed as a risk taker or a troublemaker when you're staying true to your own self. And I don't know what educational path we have to take. I think it starts with going back to our roots and doing the legwork of learning our histories, learning what our ancestors, their histories, and incorporating it to today, because we are facing a reckoning where the ideologies that we're facing in the United States, the white supremacy ideologies, are trying to wipe away our history and our culture. And the more that we give in to this idea of being accepted, the more it's being erased. And it's a really hard path. I mean, there's a lot of Latinos who don't even realize they're in denial. This is what they think is normal. So sometimes even approaching it in that way by saying they're in denial may make it harder for them to really get down to the roots of who they are and being comfortable with it.
Could I throw a wrench in this? And I'm sorry, Maria, that I'm jumping in, but we are talking about, ignorance, education, and I've heard us a couple of times use the term white passing. And I think it's important to bring up, I know we're all searching for terms, when it comes to identity, we're in a constant search for the right words to describe an experience. But I think even this term white passing brings a lot of comfort to white Latinos, right? So like a native Latina or a Black Latina doesn't pass as native or doesn't pass as Black, right? Like Amara la Negra doesn't pass as a Black woman. She is a Black woman. And so with white Latinos, I think it's time for us to get uncomfortable. We ask a lot from Anglo white people, right? We ask a lot from like the Paris Hiltons of the world, like check your privilege, get uncomfortable. But it's time for those of us in the Latino community to equally get as uncomfortable and really assess the privilege that you have. So yeah, like people in media like Lin-Manuel, if you stated like, if your name wasn't Lin-Manuel Miranda, and you didn't speak Spanish, how would people clock you? How would you walk through the world? How do people treat you based on just your phenotype? And I think that assessment is really difficult, very uncomfortable, but it's time, it's overdue that we do that assessment.
Although I don't want to get into oppression Olympics, because that's like certainly not where we want to go.
No.
But I do think, as I was writing about my father, may he rest in peace, and just kind of the anti-Blackness that he carried, with him, which was so confusing because it was very real. And yet, of course, as it goes, his best friend in the world was a Black man from Mississippi. So, and having to kind of put that on paper, mi papa with his, like, we have to say it. You're right. We have to get uncomfortable. And that is part of the process. Marta has always inspired me. Marta has made me feel uncomfortable in many moments. And Marta has always also been someone who has opened herself up. Again, Marta, you're right. You were part of many people who were leading this conversation. But to me, you were certainly la reina de la conversación. Obviamente la reina siendo Celia Cruz, but Marta, some final thoughts. And I'd actually love it if we could. It's a little difficult, but the question was raised, and we are doing this conversation within Hispanics in Philanthropy. So your final thoughts, the three of you, Marta, and if you can, also talk about the role and responsibility of philanthropy to propel the conversation.
Well, philanthropy historically, we're not talking about HIP, right? We're talking and APFI, right, which are now sort of philanthropies that are geared, right, to our communities. But historically, and including HIP, has to ask for money, right? And the privilege of being funded requires adhering to certain criteria. And philanthropy has historically been rich white men and racist rich white men. And so they have evaded taxes, right? Because they're going to do a public good, right? That's what philanthropy does, a public good. But their goodness has not necessarily been for people who are underprivileged, people who have been historically marginalized or disenfranchised. We have to understand that as well for education. Education has been an arm of white supremacy in terms of erasing histories, erasing cultures, and developing myth. Right? Has been, in part the news media. So we've been surrounded by institutions that have perpetuated a myth of white supremacy and an actuality of white supremacy, right? Because it's the power of money when you're dealing with a capitalist system. So that wherever we have forums, and all of us have forums, be it as parents, be it as community members, be it as professionals in whatever field we're in, to call it, right? To call what we see, to call the goodness of what we see, and also call the negativity of what we see. And that's sort of what happened with the Heights, right? Because I have nothing against Lin-Manuel. I have nothing against Rita Moreno. I adore you. We go back a long time. But the fact that you can produce a film that doesn't capture the spectrum of who we are when you have the opportunity to do that. I haven't listened to Kat's program, but actually that's our responsibility, to show the spectrum and the diversity of who we are, right? And if you're dealing with a Black community and then you don't even recognize that Black community, then you have to say, well, what is the lens that you're looking through? Why is it that you're afraid to say the truth and you come from that community, right? And that's an added responsibility we have. And it was spoken about, right? Do you lose your job? What risks are you willing to take? Right? That comes down to the foundation, right? I chose not to stay at the university because I chose not to continue perpetuating a myth. And I had to speak truth as I understood it. And I understand other people have their truth. But we also understand lies. And when lies become the process of education, when lies become the process of demeaning certain groups and lifting other groups, right? And making sure that others stay at the bottom, because that's where we are. It is our young people that are in prisons. It is our young people that are not completing education. I'm right now in an area in Puerto Rico where the schools were closed down. Children have to travel at least a half hour or more, right? The access to the internet. What is going to create your being part of a society today, 2021? If you don't have access to internet, if you don't have access to all of the technology, right, that we're on right now, right? And the community I'm in, that's at risk. In Mississippi, how many young people have access to internet and Wi-Fi and so on and so forth, right? So that if we're not talking about that, I don't care what color you are. You are a participant and complicit in our communities being marginalized, racialized, and on the margins. You are complicit. So that's the conversation we have to enter. How complicit are we in assuring that some of us stay on the margins? And I like what Kat said in terms of this use of language, or like I'm closer to white, right? I'm white passing. That has to stop. That has to stop right now, absolutely right now. Narrative is critical. And as people in the media, you have to develop a narrative that's empowering to our communities and destroys that notion of white being the supremeness of being.
Right. Marta, thank you so much for everything that you've done in opening this conversation and for keeping it going and for keeping it real. I really appreciate it. Quick final thoughts from Milak and then Kat.
I mean, for me, I echo what Marta had said. Everything she said is resonating with me. I think the time is now, what Kat and Marta have said, to hold institutions and people accountable, start to break the barriers for things that we usually are not used to breaking, get uncomfortable. We have to start holding foundations accountable in philanthropy and pushing for, nobody knows what Latinos need except Latinos, and we can no longer allow others to speak for us and tell us what we need and to break these barriers, to continue to elevate ourselves in a position that does bring and centralize more power to the overall community.
And Kat.
I'll keep it short. Obviously echoing what everyone's saying, in particular Martha. Aside from being uncomfortable, I think it's time, and I'm speaking directly to non-Black Latinos, I'm speaking to Latinos like myself who benefit from white supremacy. I think it's it's time for us to sacrifice things. And that means sacrifice time. That means sacrifice power. That means sacrifice social capital. And at times, I do think it means, sacrifice and put your life out on the line. Means get out there, protest, and get active.
So, as you know, I'm a journalist, and I have spent the entirety of my career, several decades now, trying to, as Marta says, correct the narrative. I just want to leave you with a couple of things that I don't do. In my newsroom, you will never hear the word minority, ever. In my newsroom, you will never hear the word illegal to refer to a human being. I never use the word slave. I refer to this person as an enslaved person. And I speak about slavery as really what it is to me, which is international, corporatized, government-supported human trafficking. That is what slavery is. Marta said it is our people, our Black brothers and sisters, brown brothers and sisters, indigenous brothers and sisters who are filling and here's the thing, we are the ones who are behind bars, and we're behind every kind of bars. We're behind prison bars, we're behind jail bars, and we're behind immigrant detention bars. That is a particular reality that we face as Latinos and Latinas. And so I'm just very thankful to HIP for pushing us. And I hope some of you felt a little uncomfortable. As I said, it is about feeling uncomfortable. It is about doing that painful work and listening to the brilliant people in our community who help us to have more clarity, like Marta Moreno Vega. Thank you so much, Malak Rashid, and to Kat Lazo as well. Back to you.